I've never told anyone this story in full because even now, years later, it still doesn't make sense. I was 19 at the time, living with my parents in a quiet residential area where nothing ever really happened. Our house sat near the end of a long street, the kind where cars only pass through if they actually lived there. It was calm, predictable, and boring in the safest way possible. One night, around 1:30 a.m., I was still awake in my room scrolling on my phone when I noticed headlights outside my window. That alone wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was how slowly the car was moving. It wasn't driving past, it was creeping. The headlights slid across my wall like they were being dragged inch by inch. I stood up and peeked through the blinds. A dark sedan was rolling down the street at a walking pace. No music. No engine noise I could hear. Just headlights drifting forward. I watched it pass my house, expecting it to speed up once it reached the corner, but it didn't. It disappeared from view just as slowly as it came. I told myself it was probably someone lost or checking addresses. I went back to bed. About 10 minutes later, the headlights returned. This time, the car stopped directly in front of my house. The engine stayed on, but no one got out. I waited, holding the blinds just enough to see. The car sat there for several minutes, completely still. I felt silly being nervous, but something about the way it parked so precisely in front of my driveway bothered me. Then the headlights turned off. The car stayed. At that point, I stepped back from the window. I didn't want whoever was inside to see me watching. I waited another few minutes, then carefully looked again. The car was gone. The next morning, my mom asked if I had come home late the night before. When I said no, she told me she'd seen a car parked outside around 2 in the morning and assumed it was mine or a friend's. She said it sat there long enough that she considered calling out to see if someone needed help. That was the first time I realized I hadn't imagined it. Nothing happened for weeks after that. I almost forgot about it. Then one evening, while pulling into the driveway after work, I noticed tire marks on the curb directly in front of our house. Fresh ones. Like someone had been parking there regularly. I started locking my bedroom door at night after that, though I couldn't explain why. The second story happened when I was 24, after I moved into my first apartment alone. It was a small place on the 3rd floor of an older building, nothing fancy, but it was affordable and close to work. The building had a single stairwell, no elevator, and only 8 units total. I liked that. It felt quiet and controlled. For the first few months, everything was normal. I worked late, came home, ate dinner, and went to sleep. That routine changed the night I heard knocking. It was around 11:45 p.m. I was already in bed when 3 slow knocks hit my front door. They weren't aggressive or loud, just deliberate. I froze, staring at the ceiling, waiting to hear footsteps move away. They didn't. Another knock came, this one softer. I got out of bed and checked the peephole. The hallway light was on, but no one was standing there. I opened the door a crack and looked both ways down the hall. Empty. I convinced myself someone had knocked on the wrong door and left. I locked up and went back to bed. The next night, the knocking came again. Same time. Same pattern. 3 knocks. Pause. One final knock. This time I didn't move. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, until the sound finally stopped. When I checked the hallway the next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were scuff marks on the carpet directly in front of my door. They looked like shoe marks, as if someone had been standing there shifting their weight back and forth for a long time. I mentioned it to my downstairs neighbor later that week, asking if he'd heard knocking at night. He looked confused and said no. Then he added something I still think about. "You're usually not home that late, right?" I asked him what he meant. He said sometimes when he came back from his night shift, he'd see someone standing in front of my door, like they were waiting to be let in. He assumed it was a friend or boyfriend. I told him I lived alone. He laughed awkwardly and said maybe it was someone on the wrong floor. That explanation didn't sit right with me. My unit was the only one on that side of the hall. A few nights later, I installed a cheap motion camera inside my apartment, pointed at the door. Nothing triggered it for days. Then one morning before work, I checked the footage. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the camera turned on. The door handle moved. Not enough to open the door. Just enough to test it. After that, the knocking never happened again. I moved out 2 months later without telling anyone where I was going. The third story is the one that still keeps me awake at night, because unlike the others, I know for a fact that whatever happened wasn't a misunderstanding. I was 27 and working a delivery job that had me driving late into the night. Most of my routes were familiar, but one evening I got sent to a rural area about 40 minutes outside the city. The delivery address was at the end of a narrow dirt road surrounded by trees. There were no streetlights, no other houses nearby, and barely any cell service. I remember hesitating before turning off the main road, but the GPS insisted I was going the right way. About halfway down the dirt road, my headlights caught something reflective ahead. I slowed down, expecting a deer, but instead it was a man standing in the middle of the road. He wasn't waving or trying to flag me down. He was just standing there, facing my car. I stopped about 20 feet away. I rolled my window down slightly and asked if he needed help. He didn't answer. He took a step closer. That's when I noticed he wasn't wearing shoes, even though it was cold enough that I could see my breath. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been outside for days. I told him I couldn't help and that he should move out of the road. He tilted his head, smiled, and asked if I was lost. Something in his voice made my chest tighten. It sounded practiced, like he'd asked that question many times before. I put the car in reverse and started backing up. The moment I did, he sprinted toward my car. I slammed the gas and sped past him, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. In my rearview mirror, I saw him chasing me on foot for a few seconds before disappearing into the darkness. I didn't make the delivery. I drove straight back to the main road and called my boss, telling him I had car trouble. For weeks after that, nothing happened. I convinced myself it was just some unstable person wandering the area. Then, about a month later, I got another delivery to the same general region. Different address. Same dirt road. Halfway down, I saw tire tracks pulled off to the side. Fresh ones. And next to them, barefoot footprints leading into the trees. I turned around immediately and quit the job the next day. A few months later, I saw a local news article about a missing delivery driver last seen near that road. They never found his car. They never found him either. The last story isn't mine, but it's the one that made all the others feel connected in a way I didn't want to accept. A close friend of mine told me this years after it happened, and even now he refuses to talk about it in detail. He just wanted someone else to know in case it ever happens again. He was house-sitting for his aunt while she was overseas. The house was in a quiet town, surrounded by woods with no nearby neighbors. For the first few nights, everything was normal. He spent most of his time watching movies, ordering food, and enjoying the privacy. On the fourth night, he noticed the back porch light was on. He was certain he'd turned it off before going to bed. Thinking nothing of it, he flipped the switch and went back inside. The next night, the light was on again. This time he checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked. No signs of anyone being there. He shrugged it off and went to sleep. Around 3 a.m., he woke up to a noise coming from the backyard. At first, it sounded like wind moving through the trees. Then he realized it was rhythmic. Footsteps. Slow ones. He stayed in bed, staring at the dark doorway, listening as the steps moved closer to the house. They stopped directly outside the back door. There was a pause. Then the porch light turned on. He said that was the moment fear fully set in because there was no switch outside. Someone had turned it on from inside the house. He grabbed his phone and called the police, whispering as he explained what was happening. While he was on the call, the doorknob started to turn. Not violently. Not hurried. Patiently. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they searched the property, no one was there. No footprints. No damage. Nothing out of place. Except one thing. In the backyard, just beneath the porch light, was a single barefoot footprint pressed into the dirt. Facing the door. My friend moved out the next day and refused to stay in that house ever again. His aunt sold it a few months later after reporting similar incidents from a neighbor. When he finished telling me the story, he said something I haven't been able to forget. None of these things feel random, he said. It's like whatever it is waits until you're alone. Until you convince yourself nothing's wrong. Sometimes I think about that when I lock my doors at night. About how many people hear strange things and explain them away. About how many times we assume we're safe just because nothing has happened yet. And I wonder how many stories never get told because someone waited too long to leave.